if I had my audio. There we go. All right. Well, it's great to see everybody this morning. Super excited to get to share a little bit about the work that I've been doing in the book that came out now just about 2 years ago after an extended research project. I just wanted to set a little bit of context here before I dive in, but some of you may be familiar with Luke Holman's work. He wrote the book Innovation Games, which came out about 10 years uh, um, before Dave Gray's book Game Storming, and it's really on how to use game mechanics to get stuff done inside, an organization's walls, and specifically how to enable teams to do better work. And I met Luke many years ago. We became friends. He's become very much a mentor and creative partner in some regards. And he's certainly one of the brightest minds in terms of the topic of prioritization. Back in about 2014, I think it was, I got asked to do a TEDx talk, which was on uh, problem framing and diagnostic thinking. It was called The Problem Is Not the Problem. And then I got asked to give that talk at South by Southwest, and then I got asked to give that talk at USAA, and then at Adobe and the Innovation Games Summit. And every time I gave the talk, people raised their hands at the end of the talk and asked me questions about prioritization. And I thought that was really strange because I thought prioritization was just this fundamental topic that everybody kind of understood, right? I mean, we're all pretty good at it, it seems. And so I was on the strategic advisory board for Rosenfeld Media, working with Lou Rosenfeld. Some of you may know of Rosenfeld Media's work. They compete effectively with O'Reilly. They really focus on design and the intersection of design and business. And I called Lou and said, "Hey, man, I'm getting all these questions on prioritization when I'm doing this talk on, creative problem solving, and I can't find any good books on the subject." And he said, "That's crazy." And so we both independently spent some time doing some research and came back a few weeks later and agreed there were actually no books, none, on the topic of prioritization that looks at holistically how do you solve prioritization problems, the real how-to of prioritization problems for individuals, teams, and organizations. And Lou prompted me to write the book. And I thought it was going to be a piece of cake. It was not a piece of cake. It turns out I now have a very deep understanding of why the topic is so tricky. I'm now probably 10 years in, maybe 10 years plus at this point, into deeply understanding why it's such a tricky topic. I've tried to do the best job I can to frame up how to think about it in the simplest possible way as a process model, which is what the first two parts of the book are, and then for individuals, and then for teams and organizations and how they all relate to one another. And one of the big takeaways in the initial research for the book was, I probably talked to a couple hundred people across the range of companies, from construction companies to NASA to tech companies to, people sitting in coffee shops. I mean, pretty broad range of people, and specifically focused on high performing individuals, high performing teams, and high performing organizations. And the penny dropped for me as I was trying to really get the book focused in about 2018 or 2019, when it became apparent that, the most effective organizations figure out how to prioritize pretty effectively. They may not do it with the best tools, they may not do it with the best process, it may not be all that fun, it may not be something they can communicate effectively or repeat predictably, but they do it. The Apples and the Amazons, and name your favorite company, they figure out how to look at all the options they have on the table and sort through them to get the ones that are most impactful and get them at the top of the list, and get the ones that are least impactful and get them on the bottom of the list. And those organizations are composed of teams that are particularly good at this as well. And those teams are built on individual contributors that have a higher degree of discernment about what matters most. And they tend to have a process for being more effective to really identify the things that are going to be the difference makers. And one of the reasons the topic is so tricky is people tend to conflate it or confuse it with productivity. And prioritization and productivity are two entirely separate topics. They are related, there's a loose coupling between them, but your priorities are your inputs to your plans and your decisions. And productivity is about getting more stuff done, and it's about doing it more effectively and doing it more efficiently, but it isn't necessarily solely dedicated to understanding what you should be paying attention to. Because your priorities are the things you should be paying attention to. They're not just the things you should be doing. So the other penny dropped for me when it became apparent that your priorities can be in any category. They can be in the category of people. You can prioritize people. You can prioritize places, things, activities, all sorts of different kinds of information, processes. Like most people, when they think about prioritization, they think about the stuff they need to do. But it turns out that is just one small slice of what prioritization gives you a key to unlock. And bringing it back to teams, one of the most interesting things is it turns out that teams in general are better at prioritizing than organizations, and teams are better at organizing and prioritizing than people, individuals, because in a discipline, whatever it happens to be, whether it's service design or whether it's emergency response or whether it's banking or whether it's oil and gas, they tend to have an understanding of the domain, and people have probably gone through a process as part of a team of continually figuring out what they're going to focus on and how they're going to get stuff done, even though that get stuff done thing is only one category of prioritization, right? And so part of what was so tricky about writing the book was really discerning what is the difference between team productivity and team prioritization. And so the two chapters that I really wanted to focus on, and I know I was supposed to focus on just one chapter, but the idea in the book is that each section, so the section for individuals is broken into two chapters, and the section on team is broken into two chapters, and so on and so forth. The reason I did that was to distinguish between the idea that prioritizing for a one-off or highly infrequent event is it really demands a different set of it demands a different mindset. It demands a slightly different set of skills, and you could put it on a spectrum of episodic or infrequent or one-off events all the way over to the other side, which is periodic or continuous prioritization. And we think about team prioritization, and we often think about continuous prioritization, your stand-ups and, figuring out what you're going to do to groom your backlogs and figuring out what you're going to do to make sure your projects are on track and so on and so forth. But there are many occasions where you need to prioritize really effectively in a one-off or infrequent situation. And so the first chapter that I wanted to touch on, I think is it chapter 10? Yeah, chapter 10 on team priorities really looks at something that I discovered was very tricky, which is how do you set up a prioritization effort when there is no precedent for it? And so chapter 10 focuses on the challenge that I was facing at a company called All Clear ID, where I was one of effectively the co-founders of the company, but um, back in 2005, I think it was when I left DreamWorks, a friend of mine was starting a company called All Clear ID, and probably many of you, certainly those of you in the United States, have probably interacted with them even if you didn't know it. And they were the preeminent company that provided credit monitoring and credit protection for consumers who had been the victim of a data breach. And so if Home Depot, which was one of our customers, or Sony or Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield or the Department of Homeland Security, a lot of organizations, big organizations, had data breaches that were the result of national actors like North Korea or the Russians or just, nasty people hiding in some basement that decided they wanted your social security number so they could open accounts on your behalf. All Clear ID was designed to make to reduce the probability that identity fraud, somebody who was, excuse me, identity theft, somebody who's stealing your identity, could turn it into identity fraud, where they would actually benefit from that financially. And so one of the tricks with at All Clear ID is we had a system that was operationally supporting ostensibly 200 million Americans. And that system was not designed for that scale. And it required a lot of very deft, thoughtful um, site reliability, DevOps, design, architecture, development to keep the system running. Because with all of those people, um, sort of all of those consumers relying on this service, the system couldn't go down, which meant that it was operating in what, the infrastructure world calls a five nines environment, where, it really couldn't go down for more than a couple hours a year. And yet if you've ever seen the movie City of Ember, which is this hilarious Bill Murray movie about an underground city with a power plant that's failing. Like that was the movie I showed. I actually rented a theater and brought the whole All Clear ID team to watch this movie of this failing energy system buried underground, keeping this, surviving humanity alive. And so one of the things we wanted to do is the people that were behind the scenes at All Clear ID really keeping it alive were the unsung heroes of the system. Like they were preventing problems from happening before anybody knew they turned into problems. And those people got no accolades. They got no visibility. They got no love, right? But they were the ones that were keeping it going. So at some point I was like, we really ought to figure out how to reward those folks. Like it became apparent to me because I was the VP of product there, which meant I own product design, development, service design, IT, security, like anything that touched the product in any way was my responsibility. And one of the biggest concerns there was that we would lose these crucial people who were doing the yeoman's work of keeping everything alive. And so they had a culture committee, and they asked me to join the culture committee and figure out how to kind of reinforce the impact that the culture was having, the positive aspects of the culture, and minimize the negative impact of the culture. And the negative impact of the culture was really how do we reduce heroics, right? Because there were always situations where there were circumstances that were just blowing up, right? And we had to fix it before the system went down. And so there were a couple people, more than a couple, that were brilliant at just diving and saving the system and keeping it up and running. But I think the reason that All Clear ID was successful to a large extent had nothing to do with them. It actually had to do with the people that were preventing the problems that we never had to dive and save for. So I wanted to put a reward together, some kind of program to ensure that these people were going to get recognized and compensated and get some love for the contributions they were making very much behind the scenes. And that's what Chapter 10 is about. The essence of that turned out to be that prioritizing in an episodic situation, that is a one-off situation, like you could think of getting a job as a one-off situation, right? It's infrequent. Hopefully you're not doing it every week or every year, right? Hopefully you have an opportunity to work in a more uh, consistent, continuous basis with an organization, whether it's your own or somebody else's. So let's call it an episodic situation. Buying a house is another one. You don't do it very frequently, right? Any major purchase, an auto, a house, um, a health situation, like a serious health situation, that might be another episodic situation. Uh, an acquisition might be another one. And so looking at how do you set up a prioritization effort for an episodic situation that's not about getting an efficient Scrum team going. That's not about making your team more productive. That's about figuring out how to set up some way of evaluating what you're trying to what outcomes you're trying to promote, and what positive outcomes you're trying to promote and what negative outcomes you're trying to demote. And that might be identifying symptoms, it might be identifying risks, it might be identifying data that you need to be evaluating, it might be identifying how that data is rolling into different kinds of uh, business intelligence, and then how that's being distributed out to different people. So you may want to be prioritizing people. And so the essence of chapter 10 is saying, if you're going to prioritize in an episodic situation, there's a good chance that nobody has done that prioritization before. And so you're going to have to think through how that prioritization effort is going to work. And if you're going to be forward thinking about it, and this is particularly important for service design, then you might want to make the investment in making it possible for whoever follows you to run that process again, right? And that is where it gets tricky, because figuring out what prioritization model you're going to use, figuring out how to follow, if you've had a chance to read parts 1 and 2 of the book, there's a methodology that I discovered that I've called D-gap, right? Is how do you close a gap between the current situation that you have and the future situation you desire? And prioritization is an overloaded term. And by that, I mean, when I say prioritize, I don't just mean the act of ranking a list or running a spreadsheet. I mean, it is the whole process of figuring out if you have time to prioritize, figuring out if you have time, how you're going to approach it, where you're going to get the information and the potential priorities from, then going about gathering. So D, decide, E is engage in the process to get traction, gathering, D, gap, uh, is about, collecting the potential priorities and the information about them, the metadata, the criteria that you might use to evaluate them, and so on and so forth. Then arranging or assessing them, deduplicating them, clarifying them, doing what you need to do to make sure that you have a really clean set of potential priorities. And then the final act is really the prioritization effort. So D-gap, it's about removing the gap so that you can focus on what it is that matters most. So the idea is, in an episodic situation, a one-off or infrequent situation where you need to prioritize, the act of prioritization is just the last piece. And so it's all the stuff before that that turns out to be the tricky bits. And one of the places I learned about this was I spent a few years at DreamWorks Animation. We made Shrek and Shrek 2. You guys have probably seen the movie. I managed the intranet for the company. That's the communication, collaboration, and publishing hub for how the movies got made. And a 3D animated film is 100% software. And so when you think about it, the idea that you've got a studio that may be distributed across continents that has to produce what amounts to a pixel perfect 88 to 90 minute distributable binary that people can watch and get entertainment from. And it's got to be beautiful, and it's got to be the story's got to be coherent, and it's got to be compelling, and people have to be willing and able to pay to go see it. What I learned at DreamWorks was that the part where you make the movie is actually only about a third of the work. The part where you figure out how you're going to make the movie and setting everything up to make the movie, like, there's a chair that Shrek sits on, but that chair didn't exist before they started the film. That chair was software. It had to be modeled. And that's all of that stuff happens in pre-production. That's before the movie gets made. And prioritization is very much the same way. A lot of the work happens before you actually do the prioritization. And what chapter 10 does is it slows down the process to say, hey, look, if you're going to prioritize something, you need to be pretty clear about what you're going to prioritize, why you're prioritizing it, how you're going to prioritize it. Okay, fine. That's true for individuals, that's true for teams, and it's true for organizations. It's really complicated. It can be really complicated in a large organization. It can be sufficiently complicated or complex in a team environment, and it's obviously going to be generally significantly simpler in an individual situation. But the idea is if you want to set that up so that it's a repeatable process, or at least something that you're not going to have to invest a lot of time and energy and reinvent in the future, you have to build a playbook around it that captures the thinking that went into building the prioritization approach. And that's what chapter 10 focuses on. What it does is it says, look, yes, the prioritization piece is important, but that is actually the minor part in some ways of prioritizing for a team in an episodic situation. Because if you want to get good, what you really want to do is be able to kind of press a button and redo that in the future. In the case of chapter 10, where we developed the Unsung Hero Award, we could have just done it as a one-off, right? We could have said, okay, Steven Zemlicka, this guy that was just sitting in back eating, space food sticks and drinking Diet Coke, who was like saving the world. Like nobody, like people knew who he was, but he was really quiet and he was always way out in front fixing stuff. Most of the time he was fixing it before anybody realized it was about to break. So, okay, fine. We could have given him the award. We could have done the prioritization effort. We could have evaluated everybody at the company. We could have developed what criteria we were going to use to identify who was the unsung hero so that we could give them the award. We could have run that effort. We could have given them the award. We could have written them the check. And then next year, what do we do? Do we have to do we have to go through that whole thing again and figure it all out from scratch? Or is there a playbook? And in that playbook is the prioritization model. That's what chapter 10 focuses on. It's hard to explain it um, in writing when you can't go back and forth and answer questions and whatnot. But the idea is if you're going to engage in an episodic situation, you there is probably a pretty good case in many circumstances to recognize that if you're explicit about your process, at a minimum, you'll save yourself a world of hurt in the future should you ever have to go through it again. Something as simple as getting a new job, right? You're probably not going to work at the same job for your whole career. My accountant, he worked at the same job his whole year. He's the only person I know out of thousands of people that's worked at the same job. But everybody else I know has to get another job. So wouldn't it be cool if, well, do you know what that process is or what a good process is for going and getting a great job? Well, if you've done the research, if you've done the work, if you've figured it out, if you've gone through the prioritization effort, and you have a playbook, and you end up in a situation where you have to go get another job, even if the job is in the same organization, pulling out that playbook and being able to run it again will save you a ton of time and energy. Moreover, it may put you in a very strong position to be able to communicate and share your process with somebody else. And that is where the difference, it's like the difference that makes a difference is being able to share your process. Because if you've made the investment to be clear about what that process was, and you've packaged it up in a reasonable way so you can communicate it to somebody else, then the mystery goes away. And all of a sudden, you've got a virtuous cycle. So then I move on to chapter 11, which is, well, okay, so fine. So you've done this once. Well, how do you do it repeatedly? And the I'm not going to spend a ton of time on chapter 11. The idea there, I think the thing that really stood out is the highest performing teams tend to run a set of patterns, and the lowest performing teams, not only do they not run them, but they don't spend the time to step back and effectively evaluate what's holding them back, slowing them down, and impeding them, and what they could be doing to speed up, to identify risks, to avoid having those risks materialize in a way that is going to cause problems. And whether you choose the process that I've outlined in the book, which I originally learned from Luke Holman, who I mentioned earlier. This is a process that's outlined in his book, Innovation Games. I believe Dave Gray also and Sonny also outlined the process in Game Storming. I have to go back and look, I'm not sure. But it's a process called Speedboat. And it's the idea of using a visual framework, which I distinguish from a sorting technique, a visual framework being some kind of visual metaphor that people can see and uh, evaluate without having to use any math, typically. Uh, a sorting technique you could think of as more likely to show up in a spreadsheet versus a marketplace simulation. I don't know if you guys have ever used like prune the product tree, or excuse me, that's a bad example. That would be a visual framework. Uh, Buy a feature. Buy a feature is a great tool in service design. It's a great tool in product design, right? It's giving people the idea of giving people a finite amount of play money and then having them vote for the things that they think are most important using that play money. And in situations, they may have to barter and trade and negotiate with other people to get the things that they want. So that's a marketplace simulation. So you've got uh, visual frameworks, you've got sorting techniques like stack ranking, um, and you've got marketplace simulations. And of course, you don't just use one of these necessarily, you may combine them. It's not at all uncommon to do something in a visual framework like the Eisenhower matrix, urgency versus importance, or using John Cutler's technique that he calls the magic trick, which is a version of that. Super powerful. If you guys are not familiar with John Cutler's work and you're not familiar with the magic trick, he's written it up. It's on his website, in his blog. It's probably arguably the single most efficient vehicle for getting a team to prioritize a set of stuff in an environment where you have to build things. It's just a simple visual framework modeled on the Eisenhower matrix, which everybody knows, even if you don't use it, urgency versus importance. And that magic trick is an example of a visual framework, but the output of something from a visual framework may go very much into a spreadsheet, or it may go into, you may, I mean, the Atlassian tools are terrible for prioritizing, but they do enable a certain amount of it, right? So you may come out of your visual framework and you may go into Atlassian or into a spreadsheet or into some other purpose-built tool. So it's very uncommon that people would just use a visual framework or just use a sorting technique. They often get combined, and I talk about that in the book as well. So the idea is Speedboat is this visual framework that outlines, if you can imagine the metaphor of a boat moving through the water, what would be anchoring it down? What would be holding it back? What would be impeding its progress? And if you think about your team as that boat, can you get your teammates to ask, is there anything holding us back? If there were, what would it be? What could speed us up, right? What risks are there that we're facing? Are there uh, in the speedboat metaphor, lifesavers are the things that we need to do to mitigate those risks so that no one, quote unquote, dies, right? And spending the time to identify the things that are holding you back, the things that could speed you up, the things that are, treacherous and risky, the things that could save you, and then prioritizing those, even if you do nothing as simple as just stack ranking or force ranking those. So the most important ones on the top and the least important ones on the bottom. You don't need to get all fancy about it. You just need to do it and then put plans in place to deal with those things. And this gets to the heart of these two chapters. The heart of these two chapters, which hopefully I've made abundantly clear throughout the book, is it matters a lot less what your priorities end up being than that everybody in the team is bought off on the process. If people understand what process you're running, if they understand what criteria you are using to evaluate something being more versus less important, if they feel like if team members feel like they've been like they're participating in the process and they've been heard, if things don't turn out the way they want, they'll probably be more likely to be okay with it. And in the process of going from prioritization to decision making or into planning, they're much less likely to sabotage the process. They're much less likely to sit back and say, well, I didn't do it. Like, I wasn't bought into that. Like, one of the biggest problems that we see is people who think they know better and they opt out because they don't feel like they're part of the process. It is, I cannot overstate how important it is. You're way better off to spend the time to get people on the same page about the process you're going to run and about the criteria you're going to use. And those things are covered abundantly in the book, than it is to race through the process and get your priorities so that you can make your plan or make your decision. Because if you race through the process, you're going to leave people behind. If you leave people behind, that will come back to bite you. It might come back to bite you subtly. It might come back to bite you big time, right? If you leave key stakeholders out, more likely to come back to bite you big time. If you leave your quiet but most informed subject matter expert out of the process, there's a good chance you're going to miss something critical. And they may have some creative way of mitigating a risk that might materialize late in the game. And you'd be so much better off to have identified that up front. So I'm just going to thumb through just quickly take a look at chapter 11 and see what I've missed here, because so much of it is, yeah, one small thing. But wait, there's more. The story that I put in chapter 11 is the, I mean, I think it's an unfortunate story. Is a really potent story about a company that I was a co-founder in. It was called Virtual Vineyard. So back in 1994, my former boss's boss from Silicon Graphics, and that was, if you're not familiar with SGI, that's the company that made the hardware that powered Jurassic Park, the movie. Like that was the first movie where real lifelike CG, I mean, real lifelike rendered CG dinosaurs and things were like that. That's what hit the motion screen. So Silicon Graphics built the hardware that enabled the software to run. They were the ones that had the super powered 3D graphics rendering system. I worked at there in the programming products and case tools group for a gentleman who many years later called me and said, "Hey, the World Wide Web is starting to form, and I think it would be really, really cool if we could sell stuff online." And uh, so late 93, we started the conversation in early 94, we started formulating our plan to build out an interconnected set of stores that enabled specialty commerce. And specialty commerce means selling things that tend to be differentiated by the story behind them or by the information behind them rather than by their brand. Right. So if you go to a supermarket, right, and you look at a shelf and you're going to see something from Procter and Gamble, that's differentiated by the brand. If you go to a specialty wine shop, and you ask the shop owner about a particular bottle, they may tell you about the vineyard. They may tell you the story maker behind the story about the winemaker. There's a story behind it. And there's a lot of information. It's really what we used to talk about is it's really hard to tell the difference between two bottles of wine. It's both just dirty water. So what is the difference between two bottles of wine? And it's yes, sure. If you've watched the Apple series Drops of God, which I highly recommend, uh, you'll learn that there's a lot going on there. But in the end, there's a lot going on in the story. And so The idea was we created a company called Net Contents. And Net Contents started off its mission by creating a wine store that we called Virtual Vineyards. That wine store today is called wine.com. And when I was at Virtual Vineyards back in 94, I designed what has now historically turned out to be the first online usable shopping cart. I didn't realize what we were doing at the time, but everybody in the industry from Amazon across copied it because we were out almost a year before Amazon, right? I mean, Amazon was it was a venture that was in development at the time, but nobody had cracked the code on how do you create a seamless, absolutely flawless, easy service design experience online, right? Up until that point, if you wanted to buy something online, the pay the interaction model was a single form that you filled out that didn't connect to a catalog, that didn't connect to a bank. There was no way to actually transact without talking to a human or without sending email. After Virtual Vineyards launched in January of 1995, that was the day everything changed because you didn't need a PGP key, you didn't need to send an email, you didn't need to fill out a single form, you didn't need to pick up the phone. You could actually go page to page to page, just like you do today, and select products in a catalog, learn about them in that process, and then decide if you were going to buy them. And in the process of building Virtual Vineyards as an exemplar of what one of these um, stores was going to look like, um, we got so mired up in the process of building the wine store and then eventually evolving that to sell specialty food that we as a team, Robert, the CEO, the guy who I used to work for at Silicon Graphics, Peter Granoff, the third partner, his he was our master sommelier. He was the third master sommelier in the United States, and he was our partner. And we built this wine store out, but we absolutely and utterly failed at delivering the vision that we had, which was to make it possible to enable specialty retailing for any kind of product. And the reason that happened was our priorities drifted, right? I was doing all the design and development operations. Peter was doing all the product sourcing. Robert was managing money and legal and board. And it was an epic national fight because shipping wine across states was really, really hard to do and arguably very illegal. So it was really complicated. And we lost sight of what was most important to us. And we did not synchronize our priorities on a regular basis. And so we had priority drift. And we ended up in a place where ultimately we had to sell the company. And we built a fabulous business, but it was just wine and specialty food. We completely missed the broader opportunity while Amazon took off, and now you see where they are today. So, chapter 11 explains how that happened in a little more detail than I've talked about right here, but it frames it in a context of what it means to uh, to make sure that your team is on the same page in your prioritization process and that you run that in a way that keeps people aligned so that you are more likely to get where you want to go together rather than getting somewhere else. I've just talked nonstop and I want to pause there and I'm sure there's plenty of other stuff I could say, but maybe this is a good spot to tap the brakes and see if anybody has any questions of clarification or burning, sort of burning questions in any other categories.